the first thing I said in our chat was we witnessed a murder, which I think we did. I think that in anticipation of this, it's easy to lose sight for people who don't know enough about these guys that this was history in the making, and that Bill Kristol is kind of like the evil analog in a way to Scott, because Bill Kristol, I feel like, so there's like the history of the neoconservative movement before the 90s. In fact, there's a great part in the debate where he addresses the World War II tropes, and he talks about how Wilson's intervention set the stage for World War II, and he talks about how this led to, the rise of Hitler in the intervening years before World War II, and also Stalin and Trotsky. And when he says Trotsky, he goes, "No offense." That was so good. And Kristol goes, "What?" He was so, that was one of my favorite parts. And then I'll just say, it's interesting because Kristol was, as he pointed out, there's a great line right in the beginning of Scott's opening statement where he goes, "I'd just like to point out to everybody that Bill Kristol was the chief of staff to Dan Quayle, who I think was our finest vice president of my lifetime." And then he goes, remember who the other vice presidents were, which is just funny because Dan Quayle is like, it's hard to explain because I wasn't alive then, but I know enough about Dan Quayle to know that when he was vice president, to know that there's never been a bigger clown.
He was a laughing stock. I was alive. He was a laughing stock. No one took him seriously. He was an embarrassment.
So it was a wonderful way to open it. And then just to say, it's just funny to me because Kristol sort of, as he was backed by Rupert Murdoch when he founded the Weekly Standard with, I believe, Robert Kagan, and then PNAC, which was backed by people like Bruce Jackson, vice president of Lockheed, who was also behind, as Scott points out in his other work, the Committee to Expand NATO, and I believe also the Committee to Liberate Iraq. So, and I mean, he was also pointing out that without being too gratuitous about it, that Kristol is tied up with the military industrial complex. And he could have really hammered on that if he wanted to. So I'll just say that it's interesting because Kristol was kind of a outside of the government kind of ringleader, might not be the exact right word, but as he said, he led the neoconservative movement in the popular sense. He wasn't Pearl or Feith or Worms or Wolfowitz in the government itself. He wasn't Scooter Libby, but he was outside of it, like Kruthammer, as the public face of neoconservatism, which I saw quite a bit growing up. So I've been waiting for this, ever since I found out about Scott and Antiwar.com. And Scott, if you know Scott's history, of course, is formerly Justin Raimondo's editor and then becomes the opinion editor at Antiwar.com and is now the editorial director there. And Scott has been, like what Kyle does, curating the viewpoints for Antiwar.com every day for years and years and years. So, it's obviously a way better outlet. It's incomparable. You can't compare it to the Weekly Standard or, the Bulwark or whatever the hell Kristol is doing now. But it's kind of interesting that Scott, with the Scott Horton Show and Antiwar.com, has been kind of the nexus of the anti-war movement in many ways, talking to people from all these different parts of the spectrum, people like Joanne and people like us who are more libertarian, and also the paleocons, of course, people like Daniel Larison, et cetera. So it was just interesting to see, basically you put a guy who's kind of like a leader of the anti-war movement, who, edits these different publications against the like I said, the public face of neoconservatism in these different outlets that have been pushing war for the same duration. And just to put them in the same place, to me, I think maybe I'm not doing a great job of explaining it, but it seemed very historical and very, very, I think that we'll be able to show this to people who are not necessarily so into foreign policy or politics, and they'll be able to very clearly see, really, because the anti-war movement is not nearly as visible as neoconservatism or the liberal centrist imperialist viewpoint that's we're kind of drowning in and have been my whole lifetime. So I think this was a wonderful way of unearthing that divide and putting it right in front of everybody's face so they can make their decision finally, which we should have done a long time ago.
Connor, didn't Bill Kristol inherit that leader of the neoconservative war hawk movement from his father? Didn't his father found it, Irving Kristol?
Yeah, certainly. I think Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz, and also the other Straussians who went into Scoop Jackson's office, people like Pearl and Elliot Abrams and Wolfowitz as well. There's a few different lineages and different things, but yes, certainly Irving Kristol, of course, was one of the leaders of the movement. And I wonder, I have to go and double check how involved Irving Kristol was with Leo Strauss, but certainly. Irving Kristol is, one of the main neocons. I
Like
mean,
a
this is
founding father kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah, since the 60s for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's the National Review group that Rothbard talked about quite a bit that took over and kind of purged the right wing. But I think I'm fairly certain that matches up perfectly with the timeline of the rise of people like Podhoretz and Irving Kristol.
So it's almost like the lineage, whatever, the inheritor, the sire, the heir of the war movement versus the grassroots now leader of the anti-war movement. It's good the way you framed that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was going to put this in my final takeaway, Connor, but I think it'll be fine to add it now. So obviously I agree with what Scott had to say and everything. And going into it, I thought Scott was going to do well in this debate, but this maybe went as perfectly as it could have gone for Scott. You kind of maybe think that Bill Kristol really is a know-nothing chump that just knows these talking points and will be completely outclassed by Scott Horton. But then again, at the same time, like maybe he really is very well read and could craft some very clever arguments around a resolution. I participate in debate for a long time. I have watched far smarter people lose debates to very stupid people who are able to craft savvy or kind of complicated arguments, or somebody who is not even very well spoken or not particularly smart, but is very well read on a particular issue, could just make the argument maybe so nuanced. And Bill Kristol had none of that. He had nothing for Scott at all. And I mean, in every category, as far as, being well spoken, as far as being able to pull quotes, to pull dates, to seem on, atop of the subject, to craft arguments that were sensible towards the resolution, showing how these regime changes have failed. His response in the question and answers. I mean, telltale signs that somebody has lost a debate is if they give their final speech sitting down. That is maybe the best sign. If your opponent gave their final speech sitting down, you either know you lost the debate or you won the debate. There is no question. And he had to know he lost. If you give your final speech and it is a minute long, you probably lost. But if you get off the stage as quickly as Bill Kristol did, you definitely know you got hammered and you're pissed about it. You know what I mean? I do not think Bill Kristol is happy. And the problem that the Hawks have is they can't walk away from Bill Kristol. He has been their guy on news. They can't, they can't say, he was really like this obscure, kind of actor, or, it was even if it was maybe Robert Kagan, one of the downsides to that would be people don't know Robert Kagan as much as they know Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol rides around with rappers and limos and stuff like that. He's tried to become a sanitized figure in the past few years, and they can't walk away from him. And there is no part in this debate that you could bring up that Bill Kristol could even. He didn't win the argument on the Holocaust, as we brought up. He didn't win it on blowback. He didn't put anything consistent together. He couldn't prove that he cared about the lives of the troops more, the lives of people more. What about the lives of the Afghan women? This is the guy that's trying to minimize the entire debate, all the consequences and the people who have died from his wars. He spent so much time on Syria, which Scott absolutely hammered him on. Maybe the only place that I thought Scott would have had a better line was when, Bill Kristol asked about the people of Afghanistan, and Scott said, do you think their lives will get better? He said no. But, maybe said something like, but you didn't care about them before or something like that, or they were bad before. And then the one other one was when he said something about how, oh, you think America is this evil thing or something. Like he tried to like say that Scott was saying America was bad. And Scott did say that, like, no, I think you and your friends are bad, but I just wish he would have said it. Like, no, I think you are the problem. You know what I mean? Not Americans, you. But other than that, I mean, this was absolutely great. Like sometimes, you know, like the ends of TV shows or something like that, the writers don't get it the way you hope they do. But the Matrix, you know, if we're in a Matrix, it nailed the simulation 100%. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And you know, I'm going to look forward to watching this again. And I'm sure we'll be talking about it for a long time to come. I think this was pretty monumental. So I don't know, Pat, do you have anything else? Or if no one else does, you know, we can maybe like just give like a little short thing at the end and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, just briefly, I was trying to think of a good historical parallel to the events that we saw unfold tonight, and I think the one that I chose is the Battle of Agincourt in when the British went up against the French, and I believe this took place in France, but this is that famous battle where all of the French royalty and all of their knights were dressed up in their huge suits of armor, and the day before the battle took place, it rained heavily on the battlefield. So the entire battlefield was made of mud. And the British were just there with their longbowmen and a bunch of peasants with, like, you know, hammers and clubs and knives and stuff. And so the French charge in all their glory and they get mired up in the mud. And the British longbowmen just go up and they just massacre the French. And I think that's a good parallel here. The other one that I was thinking of was, if anyone watches UFC, and I'll be brief here if you don't, but there was an episode, or there was a season of The Ultimate Fighter where they did Second Chance, and so they had all these old fighters from the UFC who had been in the UFC but their careers were waning, and the winner of the Ultimate Fighter competition was to go up against the reigning champion. And so Matt Serra is a fighter who had been in the UFC for quite some time, and he wins, and he's the underdog going into this fight against George St. Pierre, who is like the greatest UFC fighter of all time. And Matt Serra ends up knocking him out in the second round and just stunning everyone. And I think Scott did better than Matt Serra, and I think Scott is a lot better than kind of a washed up Matt Serra UFC fighter. But I mean, just the caliber of this victory, and I think especially with Agincourt, with that parallel is just that, you know, Scott, like we were talking about, Scott being the grassroots, and I don't want to cheapen Scott's victory at all, but Bill Kristol's performance was so poor that I think anyone in this call, except for me, but any of you could have faced him and at least won. You wouldn't have maybe gotten the knockout blow that Scott did, but I think in a stand-up debate, any of you guys would have won this tonight. I think his performance was that poor.
I think you would have won, Pat.
Okay, well,
No
thanks.
question.
Should we say, Kyle, that that Scott officially won at the end? You vote before. Some of these formats are similar. You know, the crowd votes before the debate and after, and whoever changes the most minds, or, you know, moves the percentage the most, wins. And I mean, as if it wasn't already obvious, Scott won the debate, but he, you know, won it on the numbers too.
Yeah, and I believe the numbers, like Kristol went from 7 to 9%, and Horton went from
it's like
70 something to, yeah, right, which really said something, because like when you think, it wasn't like the audience came in 50-50, they came in 3/4 for Horton, and he still won the debate. Like Kristol had a lot of people that he could have made up or something like that. Also, he talked about all of his friends were there. This happened, remember, in front of his friends, and so there maybe was a little embarrassment on top of everything else. So, you know, that really was a huge part, is that, you know, it bore out in the numbers, and there, you know, there's no way to look at at the numbers and say, oh, well, maybe Kristol was doing something right or something like that. It was 100% a loss. And so, again, I may be like a little biased on my, from my opinion, but I think Horton absolutely hammered the neocon, and that's why I'm going to call this Horton hammers the neocon.